One of England's most forgotten kings who took the throne following deposing his first cousin Richard II was Henry IV, who was also known as Henry Bolingbroke. Henry's reign was one which later caused the Wars of the Roses and the House of York and the House of Lancaster for decades, after Henry IV's death, would fight for supremacy over the English crown. This civil war cost the lives of thousands of people across England, but Henry was a ruler who many deemed usurped the throne, and there were many rebellions against him. He was a ruthless man, and he ordered a number of prominent executions, even whilst in enemy territory. But Henry's final years were plagued by illness and poor health, and his son had to step in to help him run the government and the country because of this. But he died strangely inside of Westminster Abbey whilst praying in the Confessor's Chapel, and many believed he would have been buried there. But he is actually today one of those kings whose coffins was not interred in either Westminster Abbey or St George's Chapel, and he is actually laid to rest inside of Canterbury Cathedral. However, in the years following his death, Henry IV's coffin has been opened, and what was found was shocking and remarkable. Join us today as we look inside the coffin of King Henry IV, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. King Henry IV, or Henry Bolingbroke as he was known before he became king, was the eldest surviving son of John of Gaunt, the influential Duke of Lancaster. He received many titles from his cousin Richard II, including being made the Earl of Derby and the Duke of Hereford, but he remained in the background whilst his father ran Richard II's government, as the king at the time was too young to rule. Henry entered politics as an opponent of the crown, and he, along with other dukes, became known as the Lords Appellant, a collective of 5 opposing leaders to the crown, and they would force Richard II, who was regarded as weak, to submit to their will. The Lords Appellants called the shots and threatened rebellion against the king if he did not do as they wanted. Henry Bolingbroke later went on to crusade to different lands, and whilst this took place, Henry was banished from England. Following the death of Henry's father, Richard II stole all of Henry's lands and deprived him of any inheritance. With this, Henry now had a reason to invade England, and many nobles championed his cause. Eventually, Richard II surrendered to him as his forces gathered in their numbers, and Richard II abdicated the throne in favour of Henry, who was crowned King Henry IV. Henry justified his royal blood through King Henry III, but some doubted this and claimed he was a usurper. And he was attacked by domestic and foreign enemies at the time. He quashed conspiracy and plots by Richard II's supporters, and he also led expeditions into Wales to assert English royal authority. He would deal with enemies ruthlessly, having the Archbishop of York and the eldest son, the first Duke of Norfolk, being executed for conspiring to raise a rebellion. But despite this, Henry IV was dealing with health problems, and many people at the time believed that he was suffering from leprosy, and he had some form of skin disease which disfigured him, and he also suffered very severe bouts of illness in successive years. He continued to be very ill, and his final illness came in the March of 1413, years before he had given his royal surgeon a vast sum of money to treat him and make him better, but this was no good. Some other theories about what killed Henry IV had included epilepsy, heart disease, and even syphilis. But whilst he was praying inside of Westminster Abbey on the 20th of March 1413, King Henry IV was taken very ill, and was then taken to the Jerusalem chamber inside of the abbot's house, and it was here where he died. Henry IV and his second wife, Joan of Navarre, were not buried inside of Westminster Abbey, but instead they were interred in a tomb on the north side of Trinity Chapel within Canterbury Cathedral, opposite where the shrine of Sir Thomas Becket once stood. The Archbishop, who was slaughtered inside the cathedral. At the time, a cult to Becket was thriving, and this may have informed Henry's burial decision, as he was very devoted to the cult of Becket. The tomb itself does carry mentions of Becket's fate, including a painting of his martyrdom, and the tomb is considered one of the most ornate and spectacular inside of England. On top are the effigies of Henry IV and his wife, and they are dressed in their ceremonial robes and are crowned. Henry IV may have also been buried here, as there was at the time of his death an alarming lack of space inside of Westminster, around the shrine of Edward the Confessor, where most of the medieval kings and queens were buried in their old tombs. Men, such as King Edward I, are buried there, in almost a circle around the shrine. But following his death, there were rumours that the body of the king had been lost in a river, and it was claimed that the boat carrying Henry IV's remains had been caught in a storm, and that seamen, believing that carrying the corpse of the man who usurped the throne may be bringing them back bad luck, and they dumped it overboard to escape any form of danger for themselves. But this gave the authorities in the later centuries inside of Canterbury Cathedral an excuse to open the coffin and the tomb of Henry IV and to see inside as to whether or not Henry's remains and body were in fact within the tomb. The doubts about the existence of Henry IV's remains inside the tomb led to the tomb being opened on the 21st of August 1832, led by J.H. Spry. He wanted to confirm how many coffins were inside of the tomb, and also if the king's remains were inside of one of these coffins. The tomb was prized open, and a rough coffin made from beaten-up wood was found under the tomb at the west end of the burial vault. Under the rough-looking coffin was found another coffin, this time a simple lead one made up of 2 plates soldered together, and this was not opened. This, it's believed, belonged to the Queen Joan, and not the king. The other coffin was opened, and part of the lid was sawn off, and it revealed an inside lead coffin. This was the shape of a body, and a cut out of the lead coffin was made, revealing the corpse of King Henry IV wrapped in 5 layers of leather. During the embalming process of kings and queens, the internal organs, including the heart, were removed from the bodies to preserve them. But then the bodies were washed and finally wrapped in shrouds known as cerecloth. These were usually dipped and covered in wax to keep away decay, and wrapping of King Henry IV's body were then cut away. What was discovered was the perfectly preserved body of Henry IV, who had died roughly 400 years previously. It was said that the lower parts of Henry's face had been perfectly preserved, but when the wrappings were uncovered on his face, his nose began to shrivel as he was exposed to the air and elements, and this led to an almost immediate decay and decomposition. The king's beard on his chin was said to have still been moist, protected by the wrappings, and those examining the body then placed a hand into the wrappings and reached for the king's eyes, and they allegedly felt his eyeballs. One of the first things that would have decomposed would have been his eyes, showing that the king's remains were incredibly well protected because of the leather wrappings, which also show the amount of money spent on his preservation. Following this inspection and confirmation that Henry IV was indeed buried inside of the tomb and burial vault, the wrappings were replaced, covering his face, and then the coffin was resealed. It was also remarked that the effigies that sit on top of the tomb were incredibly lifelike to Henry IV's portrait, and that the remains of the man inside of the coffin looked very similar to the man sat on the tomb today that can be seen. King Henry IV's reign over England is seen as rather controversial. Some historians deem him as a power-hungry usurper who's tenuously tied to state that he had a claim to the throne, but because of his seizure of the crown, the dynastic civil war, known as the Wars of the Roses, would later plague England as the House of York and the House of Lancaster fought for the crown. Henry IV's tomb is one of the most ornate and spectacular of all the kings of England, and it can be seen inside of Canterbury Cathedral, and as mentioned, the effigy on top does show a lifelike image of the man in the coffin below the tomb. It is believed today that his remains may still be relatively well preserved, but there could have been damage caused to his further remains because of the investigations and the brief exposure that the body had to the air 400 years after his death. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.